Okay, so welcome to our November, sorry, I forgot what month it is, our November Student Support Series webinar, Strengthening School Climate to Support Student Well-Being. Um, if you have joined us before, you know who I am, but for those who may be new, my name is Kate Bohannon. I'm a consultant with the State Department of Education, and my purview is school mental health, suicide prevention, crisis response, social work, and sort of whatever else may arise. Some housekeeping. Cameras and microphones are disabled. I thought I had disabled cameras, but it looks like it may be working for some people, may not be working for others. So if you can turn your camera on, feel free. It's always nice to see folks' faces. But if your camera isn't working, it may be on our end. I'm not really sure. Sometimes the webinar functions is a little weird on us. So please use the chat. We don't typically use the Q&A function, but the chat is usually easier. So this webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be shared with everyone who registered. The slide deck I can share right away. The recording is typically too large for me to email, so I have to have that uploaded. Excuse me, it gets uploaded to our CSDE Student Support Series playlist on YouTube. So once that becomes available, we will share that link. It may not be available until the first week of December, though, just knowing that next week is the holiday break. So in terms of confidentiality, please be mindful of sharing identifying information. We want folks to be able to have an open and honest conversation here, but also knowing that we have, currently we have 230 people logged in. So, I hear people saying they can or can't hear. Can most people hear? Yes? Okay,
There's
perfect. I just wanted to make sure I didn't do that whole spiel with my microphone muted. So, and if you are having technical issues during the presentation, feel free to send me an email. I am playing double duty here, so it may take me a couple minutes to respond, but I will do my best. Moving on, so this webinar has been approved for 1.5 continuing education credits by the NASW Connecticut, and it meets the continuing education criteria for LMSWs, CSWs, LMFTs, LPCs, and licensed psychologists. This question comes up often. It does not meet the criteria for nurses. You are welcome to reach out to your accrediting body and ask, but just typically the NASW Connecticut CEUs do not cross-endorse with nursing. To be eligible to receive free CECs, you can see the list here. The main thing is you need to be an employee of a public school district, which is inclusive of charters, magnets, and CTECs, private school, special education, alternative education program. You must attend and miss no more than 15 minutes. And there will be a request form shared at the end of this presentation to get your CECs. That form is open for 2 weeks, and then I will process all the requests the third week. So that would put us into the second week of December. Somehow already, that's where my brain is planning. If you have any questions, again, feel free to reach out to me. As I said, Kate Bohannon and my colleague Amanda Pickett is here to share her knowledge with us. So Amanda is a certified school social worker and education consultant here at this Department of Education with me, where her work centers around school climate and culture. She's an endorsed PBIS trainer and an affiliate of Courageous Conversations About Race and the licensed restorative practice trainer. She's an avid proponent of collaboration and bringing multiple voices and perspectives to this table. And I'm so fortunate to have her as a colleague, a collaborator, and a friend. So before we get started with Amanda's piece, again, just want to ground us in what our data is, who we're here for, and who this group is. You can see our statistics about all 508,402 students here in Connecticut. You can see the breakdown by our by race, free and reduced lunch, students with disabilities, and English language learners. Disabilities is students who qualify for IEP services. We have all 202 school districts here. These are our public school districts. You can see a breakdown of some of our staff, and then just looking at who we are as mental health staff. There's over 7,000.1 full-time equivalent mental health staff positions. You can see again this breakdown here. So it's just really nice to know who we are and why we're doing this. Also going to bring it back to some of the data that we looked at last month with the Connecticut School Health Survey, also known nationally as the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. So I think it's important to remind that 69% of students reported missing 1 or more days of school in the last 30 days. And a big piece of attending school is the school climate and culture. It's if students feel safe, they feel connected, and their wellness is being taken care of. So just looking again at some of these statistics. So 10.3% of students reported that they did not feel safe going to school because they did not go to school because they felt unsafe on their way to or from school or in the building itself. 7.2% were threatened or injured with a weapon on school property. 18% were bullied on school property, and 17% were electronically bullied. I know we all wish that whatever drama happens on social media stays on social media, but that does bleed in and impact our school day. Looking at wellness, 27.8% reported that their mental health was most of the time or not always good. 32% felt sad or hopeless. 42.2% felt they were treated badly or unfairly because of their race or ethnicity. But on the flip side, 55.6% described their health in general as excellent or very good. Looking at the connection piece, 49% felt they were able to talk to an adult in their family or another caring adult about their feelings. This is not specific to schools, but only about half of our students feel that they have an adult in their life that they can talk to, whether that's in their family or in the school setting. So again, it's really important to build those relationships. But positively, you all are doing great work. 60.1% reported that they feel close to people at their school, and 71.1% participated in an organized after-school, evening, or weekend activity. So, I mean, kids are choosing to stay in the building longer than our school hours. So that's really great. And that's a testament to all the work that you are doing to build this positive school culture and climate and to provide these opportunities. So now I'm going to hand it over to Amanda to share her expertise with you all. And I'm going to get the slide deck in the chat for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kate. I'm really honored to be here. Kate gave a really nice introduction of who I am. I appreciate that, but I do think it's important that I share with you that I come with multiple hats. So yes, I am the consultant with the State Department of Ed who supports school climate work. I am a certified school social worker. I'm a mom to 2 kids in public school, and I'm a community advocate. So I come in here with multiple hats, and I'm going to do my best to kind of weave in those various perspectives in how we talk about school climate today. I believe firmly in the importance of connection, community, and continuous reflection. I'm excited to be here. Webinar format can be a little uncomfortable for me because it does seem pretty one-directional, but I do encourage you to please put things in the chat. I see David shared his name, where he's from. Please feel free to do that in the chat, and we're going to have a couple other hopefully engaging prompts to keep us all engaged in today's content. Next slide, please, Kate. So let's see if this works. I'm going to launch a poll, and I'm going to do a little introduction here. First, I'm going to see if I can actually launch the poll. And this is a little, Kate, you can hit the next arrow too, so the prompt comes up. So I am sure you all have heard about restorative practices in legislation. My hope is that we're going to do a little practice today and see if this works. Let's see, reopen poll. So if you could, would you rather go back in time and visit an ancestor or go ahead in the future and visit a descendant? I apologize if this doesn't work for everybody. If it works for you, please feel free to participate. And we will see kind of what is shared there. So I'm going to just pause here for a moment. I think it's important that we model what we preach. I've been having a lot of conversations with districts around restorative practices. My first little nugget of information for all of you to consider is to think about how you're engaging in these practices with the adults and the staff before we even think about what we're doing with students. So one thing is about how do we live and embody restorative work as adults. Yes, there are legislation. Yes, there's fancy definitions. But for me and in my training and experience, restorative practices is a way of being. It's a way of building community and repairing it when it's harm. So again, I'm doing this a disservice. We're doing this in a virtual way, but you're all doing a great job. And it looks like most of you would like to go back in time and visit an ancestor. My selection is to go ahead in the future and visit a descendant. But I use this prompt purposefully. Oftentimes when we talk about school climate and culture, thinking about what shapes where we are, how do we get to be where we are, and what do we hope to do in the future, this can be a great kind of topic or prompt to use to start that conversation. I will also share, though, to think carefully about the prompts that we use. So I use this as an introductory prompt for all of us, but the reality is this prompt could be heavy or triggering for folks. I was in a space where somebody had recently lost a child, so the idea of a descendant was triggering. So just thinking of those things, it's not just about implementing a quick check-in circle, but it's really about how you do it with intentionality. The other thing that I think is important, and I'm trying to explicitly model here in this slide, not maybe so much through our facilitation, is that restorative practices can be heavily reliant on oral language and auditory processing. So if you see in my norms here, we often talk about a talk piece in restorative practices. I've renamed that the participation piece, really thinking critically about how are we ensuring that all students have access to the resources, the strategies, the initiatives that we are implementing in our schools. So thinking critically about what does access and engagement look like for all students. I'm going to see if I can close that poll. Beautiful. Next slide, Kate. So the other work that I am doing in districts is really a lot around behavior expectations. So I know you all are in this space. You might have been in the previous sessions. But for today's conversation, these are some community agreements. Again, I'm doing a disservice because of time. Typically, we would co-create these together. But in work that I'm doing with districts is really thinking about how do we set common language around behavior expectations. So some work, this is an example of an adaptation. I was working with a district looking at their vision of a graduate or portrait of a learner, whatever your district might be calling that, and saying, how do we define those expectations for adults as well? So it's not just things that we want students to do, but it's what we also model as adults. So my hope today is these are our community agreements. I'm also a connector, so please at any time feel free to drop things in the chat, ask questions. Kate's going to try to do her best to keep me up if there's something in the chat for us to discuss. But again, please make sure that this space is also meeting your needs and you're able to ask your questions and concerns. Next slide, Kate. So in the next 60 minutes or so, I hope to review some foundational information about school climate, the framework and some best practices to see how we can look at not just complying with legislation, but really looking at comprehensive support. So we will do a little chat about the legislative requirements, but also thinking critically about how do we align, do things with intentionality, and learn from one another. Next slide, Kate. All right. Definitions. I'm in a lot of spaces where folks throw around language and I am unsure if we're actually talking about the same thing. So it is critical for me that we set clear definitions and language around the work that we're talking about. When we are looking at school culture, we think about those large group norms, those large group rituals. That is group norms and efforts. But when we think about school climate, it is really important that we acknowledge the individual unique experience. How are we understanding the experiences of the people, the staff, the students, the families in our school buildings? And I think it's really critical when we think about school climate that it's an individual experience. And oftentimes how we interpret a space, if it's welcoming, if it feels safe, if we feel included, has to do with our own personal identity and experiences. So how we experience things is different from how a person next to us might experience things. So my point here in conversations with schools is really thinking critically about how do we understand the unique experiences of our students, our staff, and our families, and how do we use those unique experiences to help us co-create group culture, group norms, group decisions. And you'll see here, Kate, if you could hit one more slide advance, well, not slide advance, but a little pop up here, one more. Some just pause and reflection for you all to think about if you have a little notebook next to you. What are some of those important values, traditions, or rituals in your school? And who helped shape those, create those, revise those? Who's at the table when those values, traditions, and rituals are being shaped and created? I use a silly example. I went to a school and they were doing a Powerpuff competition. And I was like, what is that? Where did that come from? how can we still do it? Do the students know what it is? So thinking critically about how are we adapting and revising, and how are we including those most impacted by the work that we do in the decision-making structures. Next slide, please, Kate. She's
I just want to jump in
multitasking.
before I move the chat, move the slides along. And before everyone keeps popping in the chat, I love to see engagement. I did just put this link to this PDF slides for you all in case you missed those. So.
Thank you, Kate. And that's also a great accessibility tool if folks like to follow along. That can be a helpful strategy. So thank you, Kate. All right, so here's my big pre-correction. I am not doing a legal training on the legislation. I will encourage you all. We do have a guidance document that Kate's going to drop in the chat. Please take a look at that. I also encourage anybody who has specific questions about the legislation, you can reach out to me. I'm more than happy to have conversations, share some resources, but I do encourage folks to also have conversation with district level leaders and their board attorney around some of the interpretations of these legislative adjustments. But what I do want to share here is, yes, there is legislation that guides this work. And we know that legislation can be helpful, but it can also be challenging. Something that I like to note for folks is that this legislation is not new. There's been legislation around school climate since around 2010. You all are doing a lot of work in this area. So my first recommendation is to pause, take a deep breath, and acknowledge and honor the work that you've already done. The shift in this legislation that is kind of maybe causing some angst or worries for some folks is this shift from verifying acts of bullying to now thinking about challenging behavior. And so there's no longer scripted requirements around verifying acts of bullying, but there are requirements around responding to tiered challenging behavior. I'm going to get into that a little bit more when we talk about behavior response structures, but that was one of the major shifts in the legislation. I also wanted to be really explicitly clear, there's still a main focus on your proactive Tier 1 universal ways that you are co-creating a welcoming, safe, inclusive school community. So really being able to outline what are your universal strategies for how you create a sense of belonging in your school, and then what are your structures of response and support when students are struggling with behavior. So the law is really about those two main pieces. We're going to go through some of the legislative requirements as we talk about the content. Again, I'm just going to poise in there. There is a link to our legislative guidance document, and my contact information is at the end. Please feel free to reach out if you have some specific questions about the legislation. Next slide. All right, so I mentioned already that you are doing this work. This isn't new or different work. And so what I think is really important for districts to do is to think about not just what I call like checkbox compliance, but thinking about our systemic approach to this work. It's not just about legislative compliance, but it's really about how you make decisions, the committees, the roles, the people that you have doing the work, how you engage those in decision making, the policies that you pass. So there is some legislative requirements around the policies, but most importantly, the other word that you see there with policies is your internal procedures. How do you determine what data you collect, how you report things, where you document them, how you engage families and staff in decision making, those internal procedures. The third bucket there is really around data. What data do you collect? How do you analyze and use that data to inform your work? What data do you have and how are you using it to support students and your strategies? And then lastly, and this is probably where I spend a lot of time with folks in conversations, is about practices, those strategies and initiatives that you're implementing to hopefully foster a safe and welcoming school. I always say to folks, we talk a lot about what we do for students. I think it's also important that we pause and say, what does that look like for adults? What are our strategies and supports for adults, and how are we co-creating a community with the adults in our building as well? In a little while, we're going to go over some information around Tier 1 strategies, and I'm hoping to get some additional information around the work that you're doing at your school. I do have another poll that I was going to try to launch, but I think I'm going to skip it for now. But I do want you to pause and think about which areas of these big buckets of systemic work are strengths for your school. Where are there areas for improvement? What are some things that you might do better in these big buckets of systemic efforts? Next slide, Kate. A way to begin looking at this is really thinking about intentional alignment and cohesion. So the first, and I've said this already, but I'm going to recommend it again, is that you pause and take an internal audit of what you are already doing. This helps us lay the groundwork for effective school climate planning by helping you examine those structures, those policies, and those practices that you are implementing already. So you see here on this slide, one is thinking about how we engage stakeholders. So there is a requirement in the legislation around having a school climate committee. The legislation does outline who those members need to be, but I encourage us to think about who do we invite to the table. So it says that we need to have a parent. Well, what parent did we invite? Is it our typical PTO president? Or are we thinking creatively about ensuring that we have diverse voices at the table, maybe families that we haven't thought about inviting? When we think about reviewing our policies and procedures, I have some slides later on too about thinking comprehensively about that. There's lots of policies that you have on your books around student behavior. How are we looking at them comprehensively? And then we're going to spend a time in a moment to think about our current initiatives. What have you done to really take stock of what you're doing and to do that with intentionality? And how have you mapped out those resources? Next slide, Kate. All right, so this slide to me is like a really important one, especially when we talk about student behavior response. And Kate, please feel free to chime in here if there is something you would like to add. I have a lot of conversations with schools about students who are struggling. So, and as part of my role, I handle a lot of complaint calls. I get a lot of calls about students, either students who have been victimized or students who are struggling in school, and asking, well, what more can we do? And oftentimes educators, actually, I'll say all the time, folks in schools want to support students. And so there's this big desire to problem solve around students who are struggling. And so those would be students who I would see in that yellow or red triangle. However, some of the conversations that I'm having with schools, when we try to understand how do we best support students, we need to know what exists in that blue layer. What are we doing universally in a tier 1 all day, every day across our school to ensure that we are creating a welcoming, safe, inclusive school community where students have clear idea of what the behavior expectations are, and those behavior expectations have been explicitly taught and practiced. And so in order to layer supports, in order to add additional supports for students, we have to have a clear understanding of what we are doing universally first. So I use myself as a non-example as a school social worker. I pulled a lot of students for a tier 2 emotional regulation support group. So that would have been what was considered in that yellow triangle there. So I pulled kindergartners from a bunch of different classes. I worked with them for 14 weeks using the Minds Up curriculum, working on emotional regulation, and I sent them back to their classrooms, that blue triangle, where emotional vocabulary was not used. The skills and strategies that I was teaching the student was not prompted or provided any feedback on. I don't blame the classroom teacher or anybody in the blue for that issue. What the issue there was is I was providing a support and service that was off the triangle. So when I was putting students back in their generalized environment, the skills and strategies I was teaching were not naturally being reinforced there, were not naturally being prompted and given feedback on. So thinking critically, our 3 big graph there around environment, belonging, engagement, safety, and wellness, thinking critically about how have we defined what our tier 1 strategies are. So here you see the 3 big buckets of school climate. This comes from national research. I loved Kate's data earlier because I feel like I could almost sort that data into these buckets. But thinking critically about what are we doing comprehensively to support school climate in our schools. I also think that this is a really great time to pause and think about alignment and coherence. So I think of the top left bucket there under environment, our instructional environment. I know many schools who are doing work around their academic curriculum. They might be implementing a new literacy curriculum. They're implementing some new tier 1 instructional practices, thinking critically about how good academic instruction, a strong academic identity in a classroom helps with school climate and culture. Looking for those alignment opportunities around how are we ensuring that our instructional practice and curriculum is supporting our students. And so thinking about how we make those connections. In the middle box here, I know you all heard a great presentation. I think that was September around attendance. I'm working with many schools who are doing lots of efforts around attendance. I'm going to encourage you to pause and think about how that aligns and directly connects to your school climate work. Attendance is an indicator that's a warning system for that there's disengagement and there's some concerns happening. How do we look at root causes and identify what might be the best strategy and support? And then the last bucket around safety and wellness is a critically important one. So glad that I have Kate as a colleague to lean on here for some of this work, but thinking critically about how do we ensure that we've defined clear behavior expectations for everybody in our community? And then what do we do? What are our structures of support for students around safety, physical and mental health? And what are we doing universally to address those? Kate, if you can advance it one more time, I have a consideration.
Can I jump in with?
Mm-hmm.
Can I just jump in with a couple little pieces here? So
Yes.
thank you so much, Amanda. And I just want to reinforce, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but this work doesn't just belong with our school mental health staff, right? The supporting school culture and climate and supporting safe, student wellness and belonging and engagement doesn't start once you walk in the school counselor's office or the nurse's office. It really needs to be embedded everywhere. And also, as you move up the triangle, it doesn't mean that the yellow and red is only this community, right? Teachers should be looking at their own practices within their classrooms to control their own space within the larger context of the school culture and climate. What might they need to do to tweak some things to best fit a class? I know Amanda's going to get more into that, but I just wanted to reinforce that point and to just verify or validate what some of you all might be feeling, because I know that was some of my thoughts when I was working in district as well. And I also want to say, in terms of the school safety piece in particular, in all of this work, think about it also in context of the policies that you have in place. So recently, schools have been coming up with more restrictive or trying to emphasize phone-free spaces in schools. And that I've seen an impact, that some of the work I do as well, on that sort of foundational school climate, because they think, what if something happens? What if there's an emergency? How do I get in touch with someone? What if I see a fight in the bathroom and I'm gonna, I need evidence, whatever it might be. So just make sure that you're thinking of those pieces too, and then adjusting as necessary. So if you have students who are feeling unsafe because of, say, the cell phone policy, reinforce with them, okay, how can we get in touch with your family during an emergency? What is in place in the classrooms so you don't need to have your cell phone on you, because really in those spaces, the teacher is the one who should be managing that risk or that threat or that communication piece. So again, just a plug to kind of keep this in mind holistically in all parts of what's going on in your school. So now I'll advance for you, Amanda.
Thank you, Kate. That's so helpful. And I'm going to launch a poll. Hopefully it'll work. So one suggestion and one activity I have been doing with schools is really pausing and taking stock of what you are already implementing to support school climate and wellness. So one of the resources that will be shared at the end is the WestEd's domains of school climate and that graphic you just saw. And so what some schools have done, and what I've done with some school teams and district teams, is say, what are we doing in a tier 1 blue universal way to support school climate and wellness? And I'm going to just share candidly with you. I worked with a brave administrator where him and his team listed all of the initiatives and practices that they are implementing universally to support school climate and wellness. And in his reflection to me, he said, Amanda, my list is a mile long. We're doing a lot of things. But when I actually pause and think about it, it might be a mile long, but it's not even an inch thick. Not every classroom is implementing it. Some of our teachers have never been trained. So we're a responsive classroom school, yet half of my staff haven't actually been trained in responsive classroom. Or I have one teacher who does it really well, implements it with fidelity every day. I have another teacher that's struggling. So thinking critically about how do we ensure what we're doing? How have we defined the practice so everybody knows explicitly what we expect folks to do? And then how are we monitoring that practice is happening, that it's happening with fidelity, and that it's making the impact that we're hoping to see. So in some of this conversation as well, it's helped administrators and staff think really intentionally and explicitly around what are the adult expectations of implementation. So for example, I was chatting with one school that was listing all of their family engagement activities, and they do a lot of things. And they said, you know what, maybe we need to pause and think about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we can do it better with more intention and have our families help us plan it. It seems like the polls might be a little bit of a challenge, so I apologize, folks. Please feel free to use the chat. But really just thinking about how do we take stock of what we're doing and think about doing it with fidelity, intention, and that it's making impact. There's no right or wrong answer of what you are implementing. It's really about how do you use the data that we're going to talk about in a minute to select the strategies that you're using and implement them with your school. The other thing that was helpful in the conversation, I'm looking at what people are putting in the chat as well. I'm seeing PBIS and SEL curriculum. A pause that I had with that same school team was thinking about, they pulled up their portrait of a graduate. And one low-hanging fruit that they were going to do because of this activity was to pull their digital citizenship curriculum, to pull their health and wellness curriculum, and to pull their SEL curriculum and to say, where does our language align? How can we be more explicit about teaching the expectations of our portrait of a graduate through our curriculum? So when we're teaching something like consent in a health class, how do we talk about that being responsible decision making? And how are we making some of those explicit connections for students so it's not just a class they take in health, but it's connected to some of those bigger work that you're doing as a district. Next slide, Kate. I'm trying to quickly catch up on the chat. Love this. I love folks talking about using circles as a community building practice. Awesome. Awesome.
I also saw someone in the chat, and I think this is another consideration, right? At the different age levels and the different schools, this may be more or less difficult to implement. I saw someone put in the chat at the high school level that it can be challenging. And I worked in high school and I understand that because they also feel this pressure of, I need to prepare them for post-grad. I need to get through this curriculum. They've got this test coming up, SATs, college apps, whatever it is. And so I think for teachers, sometimes that pressure is even higher. And it's trying to shift that conversation and that, yes, but if you, and I know, again, preaching to the choir, if you invest 10% of the effort now into improving the school climate, that's going to pay out dividends in the end. But I just wanted to validate that because I know that can be such a challenge to help people understand the importance of this work and how it really will help meet all those other benchmarks and goals that they have set or that they feel the pressure to achieve with their students.
Thank you for highlighting that. And it's interesting. I just saw that too in the chat. The other thing that I would encourage folks to do, and I see that the second follow-up comment, is to think about this as adult instructional practice. So it's not just about strategies and things that you want to do for kids, to kids, but thinking about what do we as adults expect adults to do differently. So your comment about circles, I worked with a high school where they were rolling out circles as an instructional practice, and it was just being used for instruction. So they were doing very quick check for understandings in a circle format, and they were using it just to set the norms, the routine, the expectation, and for their teachers to find comfort in it as an instructional practice. So then when we throw in hey guys, something happened in our class and we got to use it to repair some type of harm, or we want to do more of a community check-in, the structure has been built. It also helped with adult buy-in. The other thing that I will share, even from our youngest learners and especially up to our secondary learners, is we must have students being part of this work. They often bring the most creative and low-cost ideas and their voices that I think can help us actually shift the culture that we're looking to shift. So I'm just going to pause here for a moment for you in your notebooks, for you to think about taking this back to your school teams. What other committees are working in this area? And how have you audited those committees for alignment and clarity? Kate and I talk a lot about the school safety work and how that is, just in full transparency, that's a whole other committee that you must have per legislation is a school safety committee. But a school safety committee is so connected to your school climate work. Who are the members of those committees? How do you share what the plans are and the action steps? What are shared professional learning that might be helpful for all of those folks? Then when you think about what strategies you're implementing, how are they defined and monitored? We talked about that. What are some of the barriers to the work? Thank you in the chat for kind of listing staff buy-in, the structure barriers. And then the last piece, and I think this is really important before we move on to behavior response, how have we created clear expectations around behavior? And how have we co-created those expectations more importantly? How have staff, students, and families been involved in saying this is what we expect in our school community? And how are we explicitly teaching those and reinforcing those skills? Next slide, Kate. So the next piece kind of to look at and take audit of are those organizational structures. Legislation does define some leadership roles. You must have a district level coordinator, which was always required, and a school level specialist, which was also always required. But their roles have slightly shifted. So again, I'm going to highlight our guidance document for you to look a little bit more deeply there. But it's not just about those two roles. It's really thinking critically about how have we defined the roles of everybody in our school and how do they support this work. I use the example of my own husband pretty frequently. He is a school secretary at a school, has the important job of greeting every student as they come in every morning. And I'll ask, do you know what your school-wide expectations are? And do you use that in your feedback to students as they're coming into the school? That's a great opportunity to start with a positive feedback, to use explicit expectations, and ensuring that everybody understands their role in supporting school climate and culture. The second piece here is around committees. I talked about in the last reflection, auditing committees, but it's also about how your committees function. I wish I had this resource on the fly. I'll make sure it's followed up on. I was trained in team implemented problem solving. It's called TIPS. But in that work, some of the discussion was around schools have lots of committees and lots of different teams. We have a data team, we have a PLC, we have a safety team, we have an attendance team, we have an MTSS team. What are the common procedures you establish? Are there common roles for your committees? Is there a consistent way that you take notes? How do you share the work of the committee with others? So thinking critically about your structures and procedures around committee work. The third bucket here is around professional learning. Legislation does require some professional learning. I use air quotes here because the legislation is very vague as far as explicitly outlining what are the professional learning requirements. I encourage you all, it looks like Kate dropped off, so I'm going to try to reshare my screen and make sure this is all taken care of. Oh, there she is.
I'm so sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. I will reshare my screen right now.
No worries. But thinking critically about how are we first, again, taking stock of what are we providing professional learning on? What are our goals in our district? And how do we make meaningful professional learning? So it's not just about, oh, hurry up and get everybody restorative practices trained. I'm encouraging folks to ensure that A, leadership has a clear understanding of what restorative practices is, and then you contextualize what is restorative practices in our school before rolling it out and training with others. I've also been having conversations with schools that are doing a lot of PD around instructional strategies like universal design for learning and how do we ensure good tier 1 instruction. That is a perfect place to embed some of this restorative practices training and school climate training. An affective statement giving explicit feedback to students using emotional vocabulary is a restorative practice, but that's also an instructional tool. So how are we making those connections and when we're providing professional learning to staff? That it's not something different and separate that we do in only these circumstances, but it's really an instructional practice that we use. Oh, I see this. Teachers have expressed a lack of training. And I think that is really important, Polly. Thank you for mentioning this and around non-certified staff. One, it's critical that there's a clear professional learning plan. What do our staff need to know? How have we taught them that, and how are we supporting that? And then I think you bring up another unique challenge around non-certified staff. Oftentimes, your ability to provide professional learning, constraints around paid time off, all of those things is challenging. Hopefully, I'm going to share some good resources at the end that you can think about how you could tweak and use those to support some of that professional learning. But those are real, honest concerns. And then thinking about how do we resource this work? Are we putting our wallet where our mouth is? Are we ensuring that we are providing the adequate resources to support this work? Next slide, Kate.
I also just wanted to point out, someone put in there about lack of training for paraeducators around strengthening school climate and wellness. And I think this goes along with professional learning because, yes, absolutely, you're paraeducators. Where do most students start their day? On the bus. What's the school culture and climate like on a bus? Typically, you could not pay me $1 million to be a bus driver. So how can you help support them in their professional learning or whatever supports they might need to ensure that students are transitioning into the school in a positive manner? I just need to put a plug in there. And again, I cannot, bus drivers, whew, that's tough.
So tough. I also see some other things I'm going to try to acknowledge as we go through some of the content. So I really appreciate the feedback in the chat, folks. So when we think about capacity, oftentimes people think about people. We need more people. We need more classroom teachers. We need behavior techs. Staffing is critical. But again, I'm going to go back to how have we defined roles and responsibilities of people? So just bodies isn't going to solve the issue. We need to think critically about what are the needs, and then how are we ensuring that the roles and responsibilities are adequately defined and the staffing is adequate. Also thinking critically about decision-making structures. I say all the time, legislation, we're going to talk about it in a moment, requires surveys. And we'll say things like, oh, we made this decision and we got family feedback through a survey. My guess is we know probably 10% or more less families actually responded to the survey. How can we look for meaningful ways to engage folks in decision-making structures? What are other ways and other opportunities we can think critically about how we make decisions and encourage multiple voices and perspectives at the table? Then looking at our staff capacity and professional learning, I saw somebody mentioned you're a small district with the same usual suspects who probably do everything. I think that unfortunately is a true story of many districts across the state. So I encourage folks to pause and say, what is our capacity? Who are our staffs? What is their role? What is their responsibility? And how can we be more effective and efficient? So I don't have a quick answer on that, but I saw the comment of like, gosh, the same staff participate in multiple committees. I have worked with some small districts around how do we schedule that? How do we chunk our agendas so they're really explicit so you still meet the requirement of the legislation, but you're doing it in a smarter, not harder way? So I'd be more than happy to have some of those chats with folks because that is a real need and real concern.
I would also encourage you, sorry.
Go ahead.
I would also encourage you to advocate for yourself. In a lot of teacher contracts, there is a limit on how many meetings you can have after school hours. And what does that look like with your schedule, particularly if you're serving on all of these committees? Typically, they're happening after school. So again, just a plug to make sure that you're advocating for yourself and protecting your time and your professional boundaries.
Thank you, Kate. That's important. And then thinking about how are we resourcing this? What materials do we have? What curriculum do we have? What data systems do we have? Are we able to collect and look at data and monitor it? Or are we doing a paper pencil structure? So thinking critically that it's not just about the things that you do, but the capacity that it takes to do it. And there are some reflection questions there that I do encourage you to kind of go back and have some thoughts about. How are you using your teams and committees? What resources have you devoted? And how are you building capacity? Next slide, thank you. So some things for you to continue reflecting on. And this first question I think is really important for me. And many conversations I've had with school, and this is going to lead us to our next conversation when we talk about behavior response. This work doesn't just sit with the role of the school climate coordinator and the school climate specialist. When we're talking about a comprehensive system and structure of support for students, we need to think critically about how do various roles connect with each other. So yes, the legislation outlines that you must have a school climate coordinator that's in charge of making sure you have these plans and you have a process for how you document and investigate challenging behavior. But the reality is that work intersects so much with other people. So you'll see here, we've asked, how does this role connect with your director of special ed, your MTSS leads, your mental health staff, your crisis team, your school nurses? So if you have a protocol on responding to behavior, where does your crisis protocol fit in there? When you're collecting behavioral data, how does that data inform your MTSS work? And when we look at specifically the tiered challenging behavior and behavior response requirements, having an explicit conversation with your director of special education. One concern I have is that typically students who are engaging in that level, heightened level of concerning behavior, oftentimes have IEPs with behavioral needs. How do we ensure that their supports are being met and that that data isn't used to unfortunately disenfranchise a group of students? So thinking critically about what do partnerships look like in your district, in your schools, so this is done in a comprehensive way. And then we've seen this in the chat already, but how are you assessing the needs of training and support? What professional learning has surfaced? And how are you really thinking about building that capacity? I did a lot of PD back in the day. I used to work at an agency that did lots of PD. And I always say to folks, it's not the one-off PD. We really need to be looking at our structures of support for staff. How are you coaching this work? How are you embedding this as part of your staff meetings? So somebody shares about a practice that they're using. We do a reflection, thinking critically that it's not just about a one-time PD, but intentional practices that we embed throughout the school year to really build our staff capacity and reflection practices. Next slide. So data is really important to this work. So we're going to start talking a little bit about some of the behavioral data, and we're going to continue this conversation into the next section, but thinking critically about what data do you have that tells you about your school climate. So the first part is around a research-based school climate survey. Legislation does require that you still do an every other year survey to staff, students, and families. There are some resources in the guidance document and in the slides we'll share in a little bit around school climate surveys. There is not a state issued survey. You do have some flexibility here to ensure that the survey meets your contextual needs. It does need to be a validated survey. So thinking critically about what are you hoping to know and how does that survey help you meet those requirements? The other work that I've been doing with districts is, again, survey is one data tool, but thinking critically about how do we maximize who's responding to surveys and what that information tells us. So if you'd like to have some conversation about that, please don't hesitate to reach out. And then looking at what other data do we have available? This shouldn't just be a one data piece. This is where I think of leaning on my colleagues in the special ed department. They're really good at triangulating data to better understand student needs. We need to do the same when we're thinking about behavioral needs and how do we use multiple data points to better understand the needs of our school and of students. And how do we report and share this information? I will candidly share here with you, I wish we could have some braver conversations about the real needs of our students. I think, Kate, the data that you shared in the beginning from the YRBS survey, it's concerning. And I think that we need to have some conversations that it's not just behavior concerns happening in pockets of our districts. It's not just happening in our high need urban districts. Students are struggling with behavior across the state, across the country. So thinking critically about how do we share this information and how do we use this information to drive decision making. Next slide, Kate.
I'm just going to jump in real quick because I don't know if you all are like me. One of the reasons I went into social work and a helping field is that I am not a math person. So sometimes someone says the word data and I just gloss over and kind of zone out. But it really is important. And I know that we all, as school social workers, counselors, psychologists, nurses, all these helping professionals, we hold those stories. And it's really important to combine those stories with what the numbers say to really create a strong picture of what's going on in your school and what what the needs are. Sorry, someone said they couldn't hear me. Can most people hear me?
Yes, you're good, Kate.
Okay, phew. I don't trust Teams webinar anymore. So I just wanted to put that plug in because again, data and math is not my jam, but it really is about combining that data with the stories to create sustainable changes in your building.
It looks
A
like
few
folks
people.
are having a hard time hearing you, Kate. Okay, it's good
Oh,
old Teams, man. It does look to be acting a little funky, so we're just going to keep plugging along. Most folks can hear Kate.
I might see if I can put on the closed captioning feature just in case someone loses some sound from me for a moment. Again, I apologize. Yes.
No worries. You can go to the next slide. It looks like most people can hear. So I'm going to quickly go over this slide. I'm going to do it a disservice. Kate did a great job of highlighting state level data as far as that kind of top left little box there. But here, I'm also sharing some other data points that we do publicly put out there. So the bottom left, that little chart there comes from our ED 166 data collection around suspension expulsion. And those were various incident types. And then on the right there is our data that we still collect monthly from you around attendance. So thinking critically about how do we use multiple data points to better understand our school climate, our school experience, and needs that we might have. Next slide, Kate. So legislation requires that you use the school climate survey to help you write your school climate improvement plans. I would also encourage you to look at multiple data points. What does your attendance tell you about engagement in your school? If more than 20% of, well, I'd say if more than 15% of your students are chronically absent, that is a tier 1 concern. How are we addressing that universally? Discipline. When we disaggregate our discipline, what is that telling us about our practices? Who are the students who are receiving suspensions or expulsions? What might we want to adjust or do differently? Academic assessments. I had lots of chats with folks, and I'm thinking of the secondary people who have been putting comments in the chat. We were looking at on track to graduate and credits and thinking about how that can be such a barrier for students and how are we including that in our MTSS structures and when we talk about school climate and supports for students. Our 911 and 211 calls. Kate, thank you for mentioning all of the rich data that school social workers and other staff have. I'm also going to plug school nurses here. Oftentimes, schools don't take stock of that data when we're having these conversations. So thinking critically before saying we need more or different data, what data do you already collect and how can you use that information in decision making? So on the left here is just some ideas of various data points that you might want to look at. And again, on the right here, the reflections are twofold. One is, how do you look at this data holistically to help you understand more about your school-wide community? What is this telling us about our school-wide trends and needs? And then the second question here, how do we use this data to identify students in needs of support? How are we looking at multiple data points to say, oof, we got to catch this kiddo sooner than later? And then an interesting conversation I've been having with folks is around what data do we need to better inform our systems? So I will just candidly share here, and this is a challenging conversation, and we're going to have it again in another couple slides, is around behavioral data collection. So I'm working with many schools who only collect heightened levels of behavior incidences if it results in some type of discipline. So they might have some type of office discipline referral system, but the reality is they are only tracking behaviors that are resulting in suspension, expulsion, or a really formal form of discipline. And in conversations with admin and school teams, what I've been hearing is most of the time we know who those kids are and we have some idea of what supports are being offered. So how can we go upstream and collect more classroom level data so we can catch kids earlier? What information might be missing around classroom disruption so we can put some more strategic tier 2 interventions in place before it's the student who's running out of your school or refusing to come to school. So thinking critically about what data you have and what you might need. The last question here too is thinking about how this data and information helps you inform your behavior response system. How does this data help you decide if discipline is necessary and what type of discipline to take? Or what types of interventions and supports are needed? How does this data drive your MTSS structures? And In my complaint role, I get a lot of calls around safety and crisis response. How do we know which types of behaviors elicit that type of structure and response? When should we put a safety plan in place? When should we do a threat assessment? I know Kate has lots of great resources on that. So I think it's really important to think about this as a continuum. I say all the time, behavior incidences don't happen in a nice little box. Oftentimes they're complicated, multiple factors involved. So thinking critically about having an understanding of a comprehensive approach to how we respond to behavior. Next slide, Kate.
I just want to do a test here. Can folks who couldn't hear me before hear me now? Okay, so perfect. Seems like for whatever reason, Teams didn't want my headphone microphone to work anymore. So I do apologize now, though, if you hear any background noise, particularly my dogs, if the mailman shows up during this. So thank you.
No worries, Kate. Appreciate you. So some reflection questions you might want to take back to your team, thinking about taking inventory of what data do you collect? How do you look at that data? Again, I'm going to encourage folks to disaggregate data, really looking for trends. I saw somebody ask a question about gender here in this group. What are we looking at? Who are the students who are engaging in challenging behaviors? Is it our boys? Is it our girls? Is it ninth graders versus 11th graders? Is it students with disabilities? Is it our Black and Brown students? Is it students who might be multilingual learners? Those descriptors, when we disaggregate data, help us hold up the mirror a little bit better. I share this all the time. We cannot change the students who come to us, but we can adjust our practice. And hopefully, how can we use that data to adjust our practice? The other piece, again, we had some conversation about multiple data sources, what might be missing, how you use community data to inform your decision making. And then lastly, and I think this is really critical, how do we share data with staff, students, families in our community? There are some requirements around sharing tiered challenging behavior data with your school board. But I think this is really a great opportunity to think about, how are we sharing our school climate data with folks? How are we not just sharing the data, but the action steps that come from the data? What are we doing because of what the data is telling us? So important things to reflect on. Next slide, Kate.
I just saw some folks put in the chat. They were looking for a threat assessment for homicidality. So I put in there the Center for School Safety. They're out of WestConn. They have 4 regional coordinators, and they are an amazing resource if you don't know or have not heard of them before. But they provide free training and technical assistance in the CSTAG, the Comprehensive School Threat Assessment Guidelines, which is from the National Association of School Psychologists. So that's a wonderful model to use, and it really just helps across the board, from things that may be smaller to, someone overheard a kid in the cafeteria say, I'm going to beat this kid up. You can use the threat assessment for something like that, all the way up until threats of violence against schools or homicidality. Oh man, I have no idea why some of this training the sound isn't working for folks.
It seems like Teams is being a little clunky this morning, so hopefully a nice clean recording will come out after this.
Yes. Oh, can you paraphrase,
Amanda? I'm going to try my best to paraphrase for you, Kate. So Kate put in the chat the link to the Center for School Safety. They offer amazing free training on threat assessment guidelines, along with other resources and support. So please feel free to check that out. I see a question about reaching out in order to get training for this. If you're looking for school climate specific training, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I can't do it all, but I can connect you to some folks, but hopefully making some of those connections. Next slide, Kate. So most people, most calls that I've been getting from districts has really been around this change in the legislation from verifying acts of bullying to responding to challenging behavior. So first, I want to clarify that the law does define challenging behavior as a global term around any type of behavior that disrupts the learning community. There are specific requirements around tiered challenging behavior. Those behaviors are really harm to themselves or others, actually cause harm, or if you have to do a room clear. So very escalated types behaviors. And the scripted responses, or what you must do, are really in just those 3 types of behaviors. However, the school climate improvement plan that every school is required to write does need to have a way that you are transparently sharing with your school community. How do you document, investigate, and respond globally to challenging behavior? I'm going to share with folks, this does not mean going back to the old school days. If a student does this, they get this, but really thinking about how do we describe our continuum of behavior responses? What types of things do we notify families for? What types of things are we doing discipline? And how do we also link in structures of support like MTSS interventions and strategies? Where does safety planning come into place? So it's more of like a flow chart of decision making that doesn't necessarily lead to a specific outcome, but helps us understand the process that you all use to make decisions about how you respond to behavior. I will share the legislation I did not write. It's not Amanda's law, but it does come from a place from families really wanting to be informed. If something happens, how do I know that it's been documented, that somebody's looked into it, and that something is being done? So thinking critically about how do we look at what our structure is, how do we report things, how do we respond to folks, and how do we engage them in this process? The other piece is thinking critically about what are our responses to behavior. So you see the 3rd bullet here around implementing consistent tiered interventions that are restorative in nature. Thinking critically about what is our continuum of response strategies and how are we working hard to teach students skills, not just punish. If we actually think of what is the root of the word discipline is to teach. So think critically about how are we supporting the needs and skills of students in our response as well. Next slide, Kate. And I think we got to do a whole CSTAG training maybe for another session. So in my work with folks, when we think about behavior response systems, one is thinking first about how do we collect data and information around behavior? What behaviors are you currently collecting data on? What behaviors would you like to? How have you defined those behaviors? So I've done a lot of work with schools. I think it was mentioned in my little bio that Kate read. I'm a PBIS trainer. It's great to say these are types of behaviors that we're concerned about, but if staff don't have consistency and fidelity of what we're naming as behaviors and how we're documenting them, that data won't actually be that helpful to us. So thinking critically about how we've defined those behaviors. Also thinking about how we've defined those behaviors with our students and with our families, not just with our staff. This is an opportunity for us to check our bias. I've had lots of courageous dialogue with districts around behaviors that we define as disruptive or disrespectful that is often based on personal experience. So thinking critically about how have we critically interrogated what we believe is disruptive and define those in a holistic, comprehensive way. The other piece that I think goes up to the next box here is when we have people help us create what are behaviors that disrupt our learning community, we can then have them help us create, well, what do we do when that happens? How do we respond? And this is good old restorative work. If folks, even if they might not like the outcome, if they were part of shaping the process, they're more likely to be okay with what the outcome is. So thinking critically about how do we engage folks in this process of what behavior we collect on, and then how do we respond? And then I think this is, and I've been sharing this with folks, the legislation is a lot of requirements in all of you, but I see it as a huge opportunity to shift mindsets around behavior. Unfortunately, I think many folks think of when kids are misbehaving, we need to do something to them. They need to be held accountable. They need to be disciplined. Yes, and thinking critically about what other things is that data and that behavior telling us about students and the needs of our school community. What are we doing around intervention planning? What are we doing around safety planning? What are we doing around first co-creating a school climate? So thinking about responses as a continuum, it's not just one thing. And how are we doing those things? Again, part of legislation, you must outline what are your behavior responses. So I've been doing some work with schools to pause and say, what do we do right now when students are struggling in a classroom? Do you have a crisis team or some type of walkie-talkie protocol? Are you using the buddy teacher room? What does that mean to send a kid to the buddy teacher room? How long are they there? Are they engaged in instruction? So really not just saying, here's all the things that we do, but defining those as response strategies. Next slide, Kate.
I'm going to put a plug in. Maybe you can hear me now. I'm on my third microphone attempt. So I did put in the chat the contact information for the Center for School Safety and the regional coordinators. If you're not sure, they line up roughly with the different RESCs. If you're not sure which town fits under which coordinator, Mary, their secretary, is super helpful. You can also reach out to me and I can make that connection too.
Thank you, Kate. Earlier, we talked about taking an audit of like your policies and procedures. This is a time to pause and say there's a lot of laws, mandates, and policies around student behavior. I encourage you to probably go look at your 5,000 series of your board policies. So yes, we're here talking about the school climate legislation, but I have been encouraging folks to pause and say, what other policies and procedures do we have around how we respond to student behavior? So this is not an exhaustive list, but I do think that this is an opportunity to think intentionally about what does aligned and comprehensive behavior response look like? That's not just checkboxing a policy, but actually thinking about in real time, administrators who are doing this work, how do I do this comprehensively? The last piece, and that's kind of under the other considerations for us to think about, is really ensuring that we have clear procedures and reflections on what do we do when an incident involves a student with an IEP? How are we informing case managers? How are we looking at goals and objectives on students' IEPs? What does that support look like? Thinking critically about multilingual learners. I've had lots of conversations with folks where there is literally the behavior is because of a language barrier. So thinking critically about how are we ensuring language access, and how are we ensuring language access in our behavior response structures? So I'll also share, I get a lot of complaint calls from families who might speak another language than English, and they'll share like, I'm not getting information, or they sent me a letter and it's just in English and I have no idea what it says. So thinking critically about how do we look at our practices to ensure all folks can be part of this work. And then I saw in the chat here some chat about SROs. Thinking critically about our partners in this work. Many schools are partnering with their law enforcement and have SROs in their buildings, other type of behavior support staff. This is an opportunity to look at your MOUs, to look at defined roles and responsibilities. I will say an unfortunate piece of the legislation is the Restorative Practices Response Policy says that an SRO cannot be part of that, which to me is a little concerning. I think it's an opportunity for us to change mindsets around law enforcement involvement and behavior response. However, I would encourage you to say, then how can we beef up their tier one work? How are we working with our SRO so they're part of our community building efforts? So again, this is an opportunity to pause and say, what do our partnerships look like? I've also been having some explicit conversations with districts around DCF notification. We are mandated reporters, so thinking about how do we ensure that is part of our process and that we are clear about our expectations to this. I also want to shout out Jessica in the chat talking about our McKinney-Vento liaison. Yes, ensuring that our students are, our most vulnerable students are in particular supported. You'll see some links to those resources at the end. So thank you, Jessica. Next slide, Kate. All right. So when we're thinking about how challenging behaviors are defined, how have we engaged our students, our staff, and our families in that work? How do we do that on the front end, not only in the beginning of the school year, but how is this part of our year-long work? How have you taken inventory of existing behavior responses and tiered interventions? How have you defined those? How are you supporting the implementation of those with the various staff in your buildings? I know this audience is a lot of the support services staff, the social workers like Kate and I, thinking critically about what does a tier one response look like? What is the expectation of our classroom teachers, our paras, our support staff around responding to behavior? It's not just the walkie-talkie protocol. really thinking critically about what do we do around documenting and reporting, investigating, and responding to concerns. So there is a requirement in your school climate improvement plan that you map out what that looks like. But oftentimes the complaints that I get from families, and I'm just going to name it here, is they think nothing is being done. And I know that couldn't be further from the truth. I know educators take concerns very seriously. Administrators are looking into them and responding. But oftentimes what seems to be missing in the process is how do we inform families of that process and what to expect in return. So really thinking about how do we map that out and what does restorative work look like. I will also just plug, as I said it in a last training earlier this week, and I think it was a takeaway for some folks, this could be a minor shift in practice for folks, but could be a great way to start changing mindsets. I worked with one district that they had an office discipline referral form for behavior. They'd made a minor change. So they didn't change the form at all. They just changed the name of the form. It was no longer an office discipline referral because the expectation was when you filled that out, somebody else was going to do something with that student. They changed the name to the form to behavioral data collection. And they've connected that form to their MTSS systems and structures. And so it's changed the expectation of what happens when I fill out this form. So just thinking about minor tweaks like that can also be a huge adjustment to how we respond to student behavior. Next slide, Kate. I see our time is ticking away, so I want to make sure we get to the sharing of the resources. The last really important piece that I want to highlight is, yes, the legislation has changed that you need to have, every school has to have a school climate improvement plan. The reality is those plans should be 1-year action plans. It shouldn't be your lofty strategic plan that you've written. It should be very explicit 1-year action steps that help us think about continuous improvement. So you should be adjusting this plan every year. It should be grounded in our stakeholder voice and our data. We should make sure that we're communicating this plan with folks and that we are emphasizing continuous improvement. It will not be perfect on day one. I've been getting a lot of anxiety calls from districts of gosh, we're supposed to have this very clear system. Our system's not very clear. I said, that's okay. That's an action step to make sure that your system is stronger, that you are more clearly communicating with families. That's what this is about. It's about continuous improvement. Next slide, Kate. So when you think about where to start, what you can do, I've encouraged you, hopefully you've heard this message multiple times, to first take stock of what you're already doing, what's written in your school improvement plans, what's written in your safety plans, how do you look at what you're already doing and take stock of that? How are you going to gather feedback and apply that to your learning? Next slide, Kate. So some quick potential next steps. Again, I'm more than happy to provide any resources or supports to folks after this training. You will see if you send me an email, I have this nice little office hour link in my signature. You can feel free to use that anytime. But when we think about what are some next steps, so I see the work of this school climate legislation in 3 big buckets. One is around what are we doing tier 1 to create a sense of belonging and set clear behavior expectations. So I've been doing some work with districts around aligning their handbooks, their policies, their vision of a graduate, their curriculums to have consistent language. They're gathering feedback from their staff, students, and families around what can we do smarter, not harder there. And then thinking explicitly around how do we teach these expectations. And I'm going to say even the secondary students need a reteach. They don't just get it in elementary school and then carry it with them. And the expectations shift and change as you get older. The second big bucket is really looking at your behavior response work. What are your policies? What are your procedures? What data collection systems are you using? And what are your defined continuum of response strategies? How have we been clear and transparent about that? And then again, the big bucket of systems work. How can we work smarter, not harder? What are our committees? How can we streamline and make those more efficient and effective? What is the curriculums we're using? And is there an opportunity to do some alignment there? And what professional learning do our staff need? And how do we support them in this work? So really thinking about those 3 big buckets of work. If I can be any help in next steps, please let me know. And now I'm hoping to share some quick resources and maybe open some time in case there's some lingering questions or concerns. So Kate, I'm going to fly through some resources here. You will get all of these. These are all hyperlinked. The first link is the school climate guidance document that was shared in the chat. Please feel free to check that out. The next link of resources here are from the Social Emotional Learning and School Climate Advisory Collaborative. I want to clearly share with folks, those are just samples. You do not need to use any of those documents as is. If you have any questions or concerns about those, please feel free to reach out to me. CAVE has developed 2 policies. One is the school climate policy. You must pass that policy as is. Hopefully it's already been passed for your district already. The second is a restorative practices policy. CAVE has developed a sample policy. I would encourage you to pause on that and be intentional about that. So what will restorative practices look like in your district? How do you write that policy so it supports the school climate policy? I believe West Hartford just passed their restorative practices policy, and I thought it was interesting. They added some really great explicit language tying restorative practices to their school climate policy. So I do just want to note that is a policy that you can adapt and shift. We do have an evidence-based guide on some climate and culture work and a position statement on creating a healthy learning environment. I will share the position statement is outdated. I think it was 2011, but the reality is the foundations of that statement ring true today. So it's not like much has shifted from what we say around that area. And then the last links there are to West Ed documents. Again, a great resource document on those 3 domains and how we can reimagine school safety. Kristen, I do some consulting with school districts in my professional role. My time is a bit limited, but you will get my contact information in the slides. If you send me an email, we can chat about how I can support you. Next slide, Kate. Our RESCs are also doing a lot of work in this area. EastCon in particular has some free resources that I wanted to make sure I shared with folks. So somebody shared earlier the challenges around professional learning and especially non-certified staff. These free online training series that you see up top might be a really interesting way for you to think about how can you embed these. How might you use these to support consistent learning across various groups? So there are some free online training series there. They are modules. They're chunked into short training content. So could be a fun, good tool. The next set of resources is kind of like a checklist and a self-assessment tool. Helpful. Please feel free to use those or reach out to Ravit if you have any specific questions around those. And then my last few slides, I really am trying to take stock of what we have as resources at the State Department of Ed. So what I have done here is, if you remember from the graphic with the triangles and the 3 big buckets of school climate, I took those 3 big buckets. Each of those buckets has its own slide. And so when we think about the instructional environment, here are all CSCE resources that help think about our instructional environment and ways that we might align that work to support school climate. So thinking about our curriculum, our standards, and our instructional strategies. Next slide, Kate. We also have some resources around belonging and connection. So Kari, our colleague Kari, is doing a ton around attendance and engagement. I just put the link to the main page, but if you're interested in LEAP and all of that work, Talk Tuesdays, please feel free to reach out to Kari. We also have our colleague, Dr. Judy Carson, who does work around family partnership. That full, equal, and equitable partnership document is great, and there's a great self-reflection tool to help you think about how 2-way family engagement looks and can be done. Somebody mentioned McKinney-Vento earlier. You will see a link to our homeless education page around that wraparound support, along with our before and after school programs, school nutrition, family resource centers. I will plug here, I worked with a district that was partnering. Their YMCA ran a before and after school program in their schools. They were working with their YMCA just around consistent behavior expectations. So the Y used their same behavior expectations, the same kind of template, and they use consistent reporting forms. So if something happened in the before or after school program, there was a consistent process and procedure use. Just some considerations and thoughts there around how we might partner with folks. And then lastly, safety and wellness resources. Kate is a really great contact, especially around the physical and mental health and school safety. Please reach out to Kate around those areas. And then our colleague, Dr. Kim Traverso, is doing a lot of work around discipline. You'll see a link to that in our comments there as well. Then I'm going to pause here. We have about 5 minutes. I'm quickly looking at the chat, but if there's any lingering questions or considerations, any wonders, any I'm concerned about, any like, I was really hoping to hear this today, Amanda, and you didn't talk about it, feel free to put it in the chat. I'm also going to plug, you are going to get a link to an evaluation survey. Please, please, please complete it. Doing my best to collect data on what are the needs of districts and schools and how can we share that information with leadership so we can make sure that your needs are met. I really appreciate you all being here. Hey, I see your concern around non-certified staff and contractual time and professional learning. That is a challenge. I've worked with some districts around how are they embedding it in some of their school day practices. So do they have a coverage? Is there a way to like do some embedded PD? That is definitely a challenge.
As Amanda's answering these questions, I'm just going to advance to our next slides. This is our my contact information, Amanda's contact information. Really convenient that all of the state email addresses are first name dot last name. So if you forget, that's an easy way to remember that. And also just looking at, I'm going to put some of these links in the chat as well, but the continuing education request form, that form is going to close on December 5th, and then I will process it the following week. The course evaluation, I put that in the chat already. And just looking at our winter webinars, we have our next 3 scheduled with some really great content and engaging presenters. I'm hoping to have that flyer out the first week of December, but you can mark your calendars now. So because of all these webinar issues with the teams, we're actually in the process of contracting with someone who can do the technical side of it, because as you know, I am not a tech wizard here. I do my best. So that might not be, those links may not be ready for December. So we may be using Teams again in December, and the January and February may be switching to Zoom. Because of that, we might not have the January and February links by the time the flyer goes out, but we will send those updated as well.
I was just looking for the link to the evaluation in case to put it in the chat.
And I will send an email out later today, again, with the slides. I won't be able to send the recording yet. Again, it's just too big to email out, and I'll send these links as well. I'm also right now putting in, this is not the CEC request form, but a certificate of participation. If you would like that for your records, it's a fillable PDF that you can download just for your own knowledge and your own record keeping. But again, that is not the CEC form. You will get that after you, excuse me, the CEC certificate, you will get that after you complete the form. Here is the evaluation again. Oh, the CEC form is the wrong one. I apologize for that. Was that the QR code or the one that I put in the chat? All right, let me see if I can get that quick. I apologize. Oh, the QR code. Okay. So ignore that QR code. I will send it out again. I'm sorry about that. Juggling a few different forms and presentations here for this fall.
Again, thank you all. Please don't hesitate to reach out if I can be any assistance in the school climate work that you're doing.
And with just put the